According to Brown University professor Corey Brettschneider, the following presidents in history threatened democracy. Here are his words from the introduction of his book, The Presidents and the People. Quote, John Adams waged war on the national press, prosecuting as many as 126 who dared criticize him. James Buchanan colluded with the Supreme Court to deny constitutional personhood to African Americans. Andrew Johnson urged violence against his political opponents. Woodrow Wilson nationalized Jim Crow by segregating the federal government. And finally, Richard Nixon committed criminal acts, ordering the Watergate break-in. Corey Brettschneider teaches constitutional law and politics at his Providence, Rhode Island-based Brown University.
Make your Giving Tuesday donation go twice as far. This year, you can double the impact of your gift to C-SPAN and support unfiltered access to your government. A generous C-SPAN supporter has pledged to match the first $10,000 in donations, meaning every dollar you give will be matched, making your contribution go twice as far. By supporting C-SPAN, you ensure transparent, unfiltered access to your government. Our no commentary, no spin coverage allows you to make up your own mind. Don't wait for Giving Tuesday. Make your impact today. Donate now at cspan.org/donate, and your contribution will be matched dollar for dollar. Visit cspan.org/donate today to help keep democracy unfiltered. Thank you.
Professor Corey Brettschneider, you say in your book that we have never recovered from the Nixon presidency. Why?
Thanks for asking. And I think we have had crises of democracy that we have recovered from. But the Nixon presidency is different in that, to my mind, part of the danger of Richard Nixon was not just Watergate, the thing that we know most about him, but were other crimes that were being investigated before the pardon and at the release of the tapes, things that we know that he did do. For instance, there's a tape where anyone can listen online to Richard Nixon ordering the break-in of a safe at the Brookings Institution. And when Kissinger says to him, essentially, well, we should go through legal process if they have materials there that they shouldn't have, he says, no, Henry, I want it done on a thievery basis. So the crimes were vast. I mean, they include others that are also well known. For instance, the break-in at the psychiatrist's office of Daniel Ellsberg. And as you know, I interviewed Daniel Ellsberg for the book in depth. And part of the point that I'm trying to make is it wasn't just Watergate that was the crime. It was really an attempt to shut down the opposition. He thought that Daniel Ellsberg was the head, the main ball, as he called them, of a civil war against him and against the United States. And in a civil war, he argued that he had powers like Lincoln to that it wasn't illegal when the president did it. The famous line, of course, that he says, that's not said in a moment of anger or emotion. It really is his reflected view. So when I say we haven't recovered, I think that we really needed to see those crimes up front through a prosecution of the president. And what the pardon did was it cut off that possibility. It also failed to show us that it's important to create mechanisms of accountability. We really have the opposite. The Department of Justice's longstanding policy, for instance, since the Nixon administration has been that sitting presidents cannot be indicted. I think that's the opposite of an idea in a democracy that's fundamental, and that's the idea that no person is above the law. So because we've never really instantiated that idea in regard to the presidency, ensured mechanisms and principles that allow prosecutions, we haven't recovered. And that point is just the book came out the day after the Supreme Court in Trump versus the United States announced its immunity decision. And the idea of presidential immunity, not just during a presidency, but after, I think is really the antithesis of the idea in a democracy that no person is above the law.
I'll warn you that I'm going to be jumping all over the place because there's some things that you have in the book that I've never read before, and you've had some experiences I want to ask you about. But staying with Richard Nixon for a moment, you interviewed grand jurors.
Yes. When
did you interview them, and why did you interview them? Why did they talk to you?
Part of what I'm trying to say about Nixon is, although, as you pointed out, and we just discussed, we really didn't recover from the Nixon presidency, there was a serious effort to hold him to account in exactly the way that I'm suggesting. And that was the effort of ordinary citizens, the people who made up what is known as Grand Jury 1, investigating the president for his crimes. And what these grand jurors did is they saw the evidence and they came to a simple conclusion. In fact, Elaine Edlund, one of the members of the grand jury, a legal secretary, said that many of the members of the grand jury, when they voted in a straw poll to indict Nixon, raised two hands. So these grand jurors really did act in a heroic way. And when I say we haven't recovered but should, I'm trying to say we should honor the work of these people, these citizens, these ordinary residents of Washington, D.C., who saw a simple thing, which is that no person is above the law, even a president. And so two of the members of the grand jury I found who are still alive, and I spoke to them on the phone as I was doing research for the book, and really they offered common sense understandings of democracy that when I said, how could you have the courage to have done that and to pursue this as you did? They gave simple explanations that, if somebody does a crime, they're no different than us, that they're accountable. And I have quotes in the book from them. One juror, for instance, named Ethel Peoples, really just kind of emphasized that point. It was a kind of common sense. And part of what I'm saying about the Constitution in the book and the recovery of the Constitution is that ordinary people's common sense ideas, like this idea that no person is above the law, not even a president, which resonate, I think, with our understanding of democratic principles, are often more straightforward, more accurate when it comes to the understanding of a constitution that begins, after all, with we the people, than presidents. And so I contrast people like Ethel Peoples, this grand juror, and Vladimir Prigel, the foreperson of that grand jury, really the hero of the story who pushed this forward, with that of Richard Nixon, who has this idea that when a president does it, it's not illegal. And I'm trying to say that in the battle over the meaning of the Constitution, an authoritarian idea versus a democratic one, it's often citizens that get the democratic one right.
How do you know the names of these folks? And so often we never, ever have an idea of who's on a grand jury.
Yeah, it was a lot of research, but they were published, each of them, during the time. Sirica, at one point, convenes the grand jury. And Judge Sirica, who is the judge, a really important force in the Watergate case, held things together, for instance, after the Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon fired successfully through his, in the Saturday Night Massacre, attempted to fire Cox, the person looking into his wrongdoing, through Elliot Richardson. Richardson resigned. Ruckelshaus, the deputy, becomes the deputy. And then, of course, Bork, third in line, the Solicitor General, carries out the firing. Now, is the grand jury still convened? And Judge Sirica convenes the grand jury and lets them know. But at one point, he does convene them. It isn't this point in history, it's an earlier point. And there's a newspaper article that actually does list the names of each of them. And so I found that old article and I had the names. And then I had, with the help of a lot of research assistants, I should say, brilliant research assistants, tried to figure out who was still alive. And I found two of them. And after a lot of effort getting them to call me back, they did call back. Incredibly, we were in during COVID, everybody was home, and here was this phone call, and it was an incredible thing. And I should say too, an honor, really. These are people who, some of the people I profile in the book, as you know, are really well known. Frederick Douglass, some pretty well known, Ida B. Wells. But these grand jurors are totally unknown. Their names were published. That's how I found them. And yet they were heroic in the work that they did, investigating this president. They suffered through a lot of abuse. Pat Buchanan, for instance, made a lot of remarks that they were really, that were tinged with racism, going after them and saying that this was just political. Essentially, they didn't, that they were biased, and that's why they were doing what they were doing. But they persevered. They went on. They did make this vote unanimously, some with two hands, to indict the president. And the story of why they didn't succeed and why we don't have national monuments to them, as we should, is the story of the pardon, and before that, Leon Jaworski's pleading with them not to do it, to delay the prosecution until after Nixon resigned. And essentially a deal is made they come up with this idea that's now known as the roadmap. They hand over all the materials, including the tapes, to Congress. And as you, of course, and your listeners know, that leads to the House Judiciary Committee bringing articles of impeachment against Nixon, and he's under pressure, decides to resign. Now, after that, part of the deal, another part of the deal, by the way, was that they would get the remaining tapes, which Jaworski did, and his deputy, Philip Lacavara, who I interviewed for the book. That becomes U.S. versus Nixon. They get these additional tapes, which are also handed over to Congress. But the story I tell, the missed opportunity is that after the resignation, Vladimir Pergelj, in many ways the hero of this story, an immigrant, somebody who really took his duty seriously, a researcher for the Library of Congress, he writes to Jaworski and basically says, what's going on? It's time to indict the president. And what follows from that soon after, we know that Jaworski meets with Haig, the deputy to Ford. Ford is now president. And what follows pretty soon is the pardon. And of course, that ends all of the investigations. And that's why we never really got to see them. And all of the things I'm talking to you about, for instance, the president ordering on a tape the break-in of the Brookings Institution, the plot that followed to actually blow up the Brookings Institution in order to get this safe, in the midst of a fire. None of that really is known. And I think that's largely due to the efforts of this grand jury being quieted. But sometimes recoveries from crisis take time, decades, and that's true in civil rights. And so part of what I'm saying is it's not too late to honor the work of these citizens of Grand Jury 1.
Here's a first non sequitur jump to another president, Woodrow Wilson. And you say in the book, Wilson modernized white supremacy. What are you meaning?
He's not the first white supremacist or racist president. Of course, that's the case. And you could look to Andrew Johnson, for instance, who I talked about earlier, who's an explicitly white supremacist president, believes that Black Americans are second-class citizens. He doesn't want to bring back slavery, but he certainly is an avowed white supremacist. That's not my accusation. It's his self-understanding. So what's different about Wilson is the combination of nationalism. And Wilson really thought that the presidency, unlike Washington, wasn't a constitutional office, that he had a much more populist understanding. The president, as the first among equals among the branch, was the only person elected by the entire population of the United States, and that there was a duty of the president specifically to pursue national efficiency. And in the pursuit of national efficiency, of course, look for obstacles. So he called those obstacles friction. And that's a word that he uses in his lectures. I got his lecture notes of his students. And at many points during his academic life and political life, he worries about friction as the opposite of efficiency. Now, what does friction turn out to mean? Integration. That's the danger. And so when he nationalizes, when he spreads throughout the federal government, the policy of segregation, segregating federal offices that had been integrated and demoting Black Americans who had risen up in the civil service, that's all in the service of this national idea of efficiency. So it combines his philosophy, this nationalism, a specific kind, which he admires Bismarck and bases it on the German model of efficiency, and his worry about inefficiency or friction specifically, and by that he means integration. So it's not that people didn't notice what I'm saying at the time. A lot of the research and understanding of Wilson is changing in recent times, but at the time I'm making the case that William Monroe Trotter, Ida B. Wells, they confront Wilson in the White House with what's happening. They see his nationalization of white supremacy, of segregation. They call him out on it. And what does he say back to them? He accuses them, and we know this, by the way, because Trotter, William Monroe Trotter, Boston newspaper editor and activist, leaks the transcript. Amazing for historians. But he accuses them of creating friction. And so he's using that idea, again, defending the policy, which he's clearly aware of by their second meeting, and using this term that he really uses to define his white nationalism, the concern
Both
about
Ida B. Wells and Trotter are African-American.
Correct. Both Black Americans. Ida B. Wells, famous for her investigations of lynching and editor of a periodical called The Free Speech. William Monroe Trotter, a Boston newspaper editor and activist, really early pioneers in the civil rights movement. And what defines them is they do it. At first, Trotter thinks that Wilson might be an ally. And so you have this moment of thinking, the civil rights struggle, the recovery of the idea of the 14th Amendment, of equal protection. It shouldn't be beholden to a political party. And although Black Americans since Lincoln and Grant, I talk about as a great civil rights president, were often in alliance with Republican presidents, Trotter considers Wilson, and early on in Wilson's political life, there is an attempt by Trotter to work with him, to endorse him. And they realize by the time of the story that I'm talking about, hearing this stuff about friction, the white nationalism, that they've made a huge mistake.
I've never heard ever before in any interview the story in your book about a researcher finding notes from a professor's class. Tell that story, and how often have these notes been published?
They haven't been published. They're in the archives in Princeton. I think, I've been saying this and waiting if somebody else has seen them, but I found out about them, and I don't think anybody else has ever written about them or seen them. And I've talked to scholars of the Wilson presidency. It might be that I'm wrong, that others have seen it, but Princeton librarian at Princeton University. I should say, too, I have a PhD from Princeton. I was married on campus. Actually had the reception at Woodrow Wilson's old house on campus in Prospect House. So I wasn't aware of the extent to this until really diving into the book, what I'm saying. And I found out, the book is about, of course, as your listeners have gathered, a battle that's happened about the meaning of the American Constitution between authoritarian ideas championed by some presidents and a democratic idea championed by citizens like Trotter. And over time, the idea is that these citizens prevail on recovery presidents to adopt the democratic idea of the Constitution. So the heroes in the book aren't just the citizens, it's presidents like Madison, who honors free speech, and Lincoln and really Grant, who honor civil rights, and Harry Truman, who really is not celebrated enough for his work in recovering from Wilson's policies directly. And so when it came to Wilson, and just at the stage of really trying to understand his constitutional philosophy, I should say, too, Wilson is a premier constitutional thinker of his time. It's not that he's some unthinking person in his white nationalism. This is a thought-out idea, as is the case, for instance, for Adams' authoritarianism. So what I was really trying to do in the beginning of the research project is understand the philosophy of these presidents, not just their actions and say that they were bad. That's not interesting. What's interesting is to understand why they thought this. And so when I knew for years as a graduate student that Wilson, of course, was this premier thinker in constitutional law. There's a long tradition in Princeton of thinking about the Constitution that really goes back to Madison, some say, but certainly to Wilson. And Madison having been the first graduate student. So when I wanted to find what was he saying, and I'd like to sit there in his class and what did he think of the Constitution? And so when I found out about the notes, they're in notebooks of students, and you get amazing details. Like one of them says Woodrow was sore at one point because he was upset or something in a lecture. But you also get this idea that really of national efficiency, and also what's crucial is a degradation of the 13th Amendment ending slavery, the 14th Amendment creating equal protection, and the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote free from racial discrimination. And I wanted to know, what is he saying about that? And what he says essentially is that they didn't add any rights to the Constitution, that they left it in the hands of the states. He eviscerates essentially this national protection against white supremacy in order to make his philosophy of white nationalism, as I call it, palatable.
And tell us about the notes. Did you actually go? Where are they? And did you go and find them? And how many of them are there?
I have to look at the number of notebooks, but they're in a box. It's I should say too, and give credit to the librarian who had the foresight to see this, that the librarian at Princeton, after Wilson, Wilson of course was professor, taught a number of classes, constitutional law, one on comparative constitutionalism. He taught a kind of political theory class too, although he gave it a different name, sort of thinking about politics. And what this librarian did, amazingly, is realize that that this was going to be an important person, not just as a professor, but in life. I think it was, I'm not sure, but I think sometime after he left, around the time he was governor, is my guess, but don't hold me to that. And anyway, he collected the books. So when you open the boxes, there are, I can't give you the exact number, but there are several of these notebooks, as I remember, some of them leather bound, in the student's hand, writing down, what was being said and taking notes on it.
You say that FDR was indifferent to civil rights.
I think that's a fair assessment. there are many people who see FDR rightly as helping us to recover from the Great Depression, the importance of the New Deal. But when it came to the question of whether or not he was going to reverse, someone he revered, by the way, in Wilson, his policies of the segregation of the federal government or the segregation of the military, or to pass legislation guaranteeing recovering the idea of the 19th century of the Civil Rights Bill that was struck down, of integration and public accommodations. Repeatedly, the civil rights leaders, sought to meet with him, and he rebuffed that, despite pressure from his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who really was an ally of the civil rights movement. It's not that he did nothing. There is this important executive order about government contractors and non-discrimination, but he isn't, certainly not, a recovery from the Wilson presidency. And if you think of what marked the white supremacy of the Wilson presidency, that nationalization of segregation in the federal government is so crucial. And he certainly doesn't do that. It's Truman, somebody who actually FDR picks because he's reassured that he uses the N-word, that he's not going to offend, as FDR was very concerned about his Southern Democratic constituency, which was very pro-segregation. But it really is Truman who, prompted by a meeting with Walter White and the NAACP, and being told about soldiers returning home from the war, and hearing about the violence against them, asked what he can do. And Walter White is really ready with an idea, which is the creation of a civil rights committee. And I talked again about unsung heroes like Sadie Alexander, who used that committee to recommend a series of reforms that really defined the recovery from Wilson, including the desegregation of the federal government and the military, which Truman did immediately. And she also proposes legislation, part of what becomes Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, demanding desegregation using financial incentives. Sadie Alexander, first Black woman to receive a degree, PhD in economics, really crafts a lot of these ideas within the committee. And Truman loves the report to secure these rights, champions it. And this really unlikely civil rights hero president, prevailed upon by civil rights leaders, becomes, to my mind, one of the great champions, with Grant, of civil rights in American history, and of course with Lyndon Johnson.
Go into some detail on the story of Isaac Woodard.
And there were other stories like this, but one of the moments, in the case of Truman, some of these presidents, as you can tell, they are deep philosophical thinkers, despite the authoritarianism of Adams. He's a premier constitutional thinker of his time, political theorist. Wilson, I've talked about in his white nationalism. It's not that he's not educated. He is professor at Princeton, highly educated. Truman is more emotional, as I see him, less philosophical. And the thing that really works, what is it that changes him? And the argument I make in the book, I tell the story of him hearing about this horrible incident of a soldier returning home and really being beaten on a bus returning home, and that moves him.
But didn't Woodard, all Woodard wanted to do was go to the bathroom on the bus?
Exactly. Yeah, you remember that detail too, and that's important for readers. That
but then they
a lot of this violence is without any cause. It's just that I think he wanted to. My memory is he wanted to stop the bus to go to the bathroom, and the bus driver really objected and made sure that he learned his lesson as the bus driver saw it, that this wasn't acceptable for a black man to try to inconvenience whites. And, Truman, despite this casual racism that was attributed to him, I should say, by a family member and used to help reassure FDR, he sees that. I think he, having been commander-in-chief at the end of World War II, that he is moved by the idea that one of his American soldiers could be treated with such horribleness. And he sees in that the need to do something. He doesn't know yet what to do. That's why the committee and the citizens who make it up, and I keep highlighting Sadie Alexander, are so important in giving him a roadmap. And, she seizes the opportunity because it's not clear that this committee was going to do anything. It could have been just a rubber stamp, but instead she proposes a recovery in a full way from the nationalized white supremacy of Wilson, the desegregation of the federal government, the desegregation of the military, the proposal, as I said, of Title VI. And she brings in Thurgood Marshall, who, of course, later argues Brown to explain that this is just the recovery can't be piecemeal. It has to be an idea, recovering the idea of the constitutional guarantee from the 19th century of the 13th Amendment, not just ending slavery, but the badges and incidents of slavery, the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, the 15th Amendment, and that meant a wholesale reversal of the legal ideas of white supremacy.
I don't want to keep going back to him, but I think it's important because you imply in the book that the incident with Isaac Woodard made a big impression on Truman.
I did think
so. I'm going to read a little bit about it. It says, on the bus home to South Carolina, Woodard got into an argument. He's was a retiring sergeant in the service with the driver after requesting to use the restroom. When they arrived at the next stop in Batesburg, South Carolina, the chief of police, Linwood Shull, arrived. He dragged Woodward off the bus and beat him senseless, blinding him for life. Was that a story back then, or where did you find this?
I think originally in Walter White's autobiography, there's a footnote.
Head of the NAACP, Walter White.
Yeah, and it's called The Man Named White. And, the skill, too, I should say, it's not an accident that story was told, that this was a strategy that appealed directly to the emotional intelligence of Truman in a way that, a rational con law political theory argument might not. And as you read that to listeners, I guess you can imagine yourself in Truman's position, hearing this story, having been commander-in-chief and thinking like, how can this happen in America? And then, it's not that they said, we want you to desegregate the federal government, we want you to do all these things. They said, appoint a committee and let that committee research the issue and think about what America needs to do to make sure that incidents like this don't continue to happen. And that's the moment that the Constitution comes back, this democratic idea of we the people, that the committee, luminaries like Thurgood Marshall, who of course we know, but also unknown people that I'm trying to highlight. Sadie Alexander is crucial. That's who I really focus on. And bringing that emotion to see the constitutional issues here.
On the Sadie Alexander story, I want to read from your book because I wanted you to put it into context, because this part was a surprise. She was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania.
I don't think she was a professor. She had gone to the University of Pennsylvania as a PhD student and as a law student. But
so she'd grown up in Philadelphia in the 1910s and all that. She thrived academically, but Penn was far from welcoming. And then you say at lunch, she's African-American woman. She took her meals in the library lobby because the dining room was for whites only. Philadelphia?
Well, I'm basing this on her own account from the archives that brilliantly they've preserved for Sadie Alexander. There was, I should say she's not totally unknown at Penn. They've celebrated her with these archives, and things are named after her. I did see her name too in Montgomery in the amazing museum there. So she's not totally unknown. But yes, the way she tells it is, I'm just saying what I found, that she finds pockets of even segregation. Now, I should say too, there's no national law guaranteeing integration at this time in private accommodations. That doesn't come until 1964. The national protection of public accommodations is as a result of her efforts and Truman's, guaranteed in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And the American history has segregation throughout it. In the 19th century, when the original Civil Rights Bill is proposed, the way it's challenged is partly in San Francisco in a theater, actually, and the dress circle is segregated, and the owner of this theater thinks that he has a right to do this. This legislation is unconstitutional. So, yes, there's a long history of so-called private discrimination. I think of it as, these are businesses. They're public in that sense, even if they're not government. There is no guarantee at that time against it. So I guess I didn't see anything in that account that was shocking. It's not, government segregation, but yes, there was nothing illegal about it at the time.
The other story connected with this, and you talk about two African Americans on this commission that Truman set up for civil rights, Channing Tobias and Sadie Alexander, needed to come to Washington for a meeting.
Yeah.
And they weren't allowed to stay at the Statler Hilton Hotel. And somehow or another, the White House forced the hotel to open up to them.
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much for these details, because I think so much of the idea of these citizens recapturing the Constitution, how did they do it? And you're getting the details here. This committee has these amazing figures in them, these two leaders of the civil rights movement who see what needs to be done, but they're working with corporate executives and people from a world apart from what they know about. And so when the Statler is proposed, there's this amazing correspondence about meeting there. And at first, basically, Alexander's told, I don't think this part made it in the book, but I'll tell listeners that, we'll figure it out. We could get an exception for you, and don't worry about it, essentially. And she writes back pretty forcefully, like, this is the idea. She's trying to convey it's not about me and an exception. It's about the idea of segregation in America, and even in these private hotels, it is a big deal. It is a second-class form of citizenship, and we need to do something about it. And in these personal moments, it's amazing. She's able to convince this committee to endorse not just the reversal of segregation in the federal government, but to create this monumental legislation. And as I should say, too, for listeners, as important as Brown versus Board of Education is, we know about Thurgood Marshall being involved in that. That's why he's celebrated. It's a monumental case. Part of my argument in the book is the most important recoveries come from these citizen actions. And the thing that she creates, Title VI, it's not just her, Adam Clayton Powell, others are involved in this, but she's monumental in getting it on the agenda in this committee. She's able to convince people to endorse this idea of using federal funds to desegregate the federal government, the thing that political scientists and social scientists really worked in desegregation more even than the Brown case. How does she do it? Through these kind of stories, personal relationships, negotiations, explaining to people. And even though now this story I think is great, Title VI idea is voted down, the use of financial incentives, it's too radical. She's able to prevail on FDR Jr. to reverse his vote by using an appeal to his mom, Eleanor Roosevelt, to convince him to change his mind. These sorts of stories are, testament to the detailed work, emotional work that she's doing in using this committee of citizens to educate them and then to really change America.
Specifically, though, after this report, to secure the rights is what it's called, you point out that Harry Truman integrated the services. And what happened then in the Korean conflict?
You can issue an executive order, and whether or not that's going to be fully implemented is another matter. But he does issue these two executive orders, one desegregating the federal government, the other desegregating the military. And, there's an aftermath story too, which is that doesn't mean that to the letter of every executive order will be implemented.
How did you get interested in doing this specific book?
I wrote a book about everything that you need to know if you want to be president of the United States about the Constitution and how to honor its values, and really taking in both books from Washington's second inaugural, this idea of the office that he crafts. Second inaugural, shortest ever given, 135 words. He says, I just took an oath. What is the oath? It's to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And you have to hold that over me. Washington saying this to the people assembled. And if I fail to honor it, I want you all to upbraid me, criticize me. If I really violate it, I want you to subject me to constitutional punishment. To go back to our discussion of Nixon, it's exactly the opposite of Nixon's idea that a president is above the law. It's saying the law is above me, that I'm defined in my role by the Constitution. And what I did in that book is talk about what a president should do. And this book is a follow-up because it's about the reality of presidents who did the opposite, who really didn't honor the oath and this democratic idea of the honoring the law above the president, and who instead really did threaten democracy and read the Constitution in these authoritarian ways. But I didn't want to write a book that was without hope, that I wanted to show the promise. And, one of the worst interpretations of this book could be, and I did see one horrible failure to read it, suggesting that it was somehow anti-constitutional. No, it's saying that some presidents have abused the Constitution with these authoritarian ideas, and courts have often dishonored it. During the Sedition Act, for instance, Samuel Chase lobbies for the Sedition Act and sees to it that people are prosecuted for criticizing the President of the United States. Courts often don't protect the Constitution. But the thing I wanted to highlight is the hope that citizens often do. The newspaper editors who fought back against Adams, Frederick Douglass, who fought back against Buchanan's attempt to deny Black Americans any rights under the Constitution, legal personhood even. The story of Trotter, the story of Sadie Alexander, to honor these heroes, and then also to inspire us to recover finally from Nixon. And of course, part of the story is what's happening at the moment. And the story of January 6th, I think, is a big part of this book as well.
Where did you grow up?
In Queens, New York City, and got interested in politics. And as I was saying before, was a huge viewer of C-SPAN and watched the proceedings, and really was enamored from a pretty young age. C-SPAN, in many ways, was my civic education.
What was your home life like? In other words, what did your parents do?
My dad has been in children's rights, children's services his whole life, both in the private capacity, working for the Queen Society, the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. He was the director of that agency. He was in the Koch administration, running what was then called Special Services for Children, and for a long time ran his own nonprofit, the Agenda for Children Tomorrow, that advocated for children's rights. And my mom also worked with children. She was a guidance counselor, working for the city of New York, sometimes in public schools, but also in parochial schools, including in Washington Heights. And my first job out of school was as a teacher in Washington Heights, a civics teacher, and I'd often get to have lunch with her. That was a real highlight.
What was that like in when you were teaching civics in high school, I assume?
I taught, originally my first job was at IS 90 in Washington Heights, teaching 7th grade and 8th grade. And then I also was a high school teacher before I started my degree at Princeton at the United Nations School, teaching political philosophy, but also really civics. And they were very different schools. They were both wonderful. The students in Washington Heights couldn't have been better. We used a lot of role-playing games to think about budgetary processes, to think about courts and the role of the courts in America. But the circumstances in Washington Heights are tough, and so these kids were coming to school despite a lot of challenges. But it was an amazing first job, and one that I loved. And working at the United Nations School teaching philosophy to students from around the world was also a thrill in a different way, because the context was not just America, and so we were really talking about principles of thinking about the social contract, for instance, and what a social contract is, and teaching Hobbes and Rousseau. And that job really showed me I wanted to be an academic, because as much as I love teaching, I also wanted to write books and to really dive deep into topics. And so that led me to do a PhD at Princeton and a law degree at Stanford. And my work kind of combines those two elements, the world of political theory and the world of law. And as much as many of these figures I'm opposed to, Adams and Wilson, for instance, what they're saying, we are doing the same kind of work. I think that might have given me, an incentive to really dive deep too into their philosophies, not just what they did.
What was the difference in getting a PhD at Princeton and getting a law degree at Stanford?
There, different elements of academic life that I think I needed both to write this book, frankly. A PhD, I had an amazing advisor, lifelong influence mentor in Amy Gutman, who later became president, actually, of the University of Pennsylvania, where Sadie Alexander is from, and most recently was the first Jewish ambassador to Germany, and went back and has an amazing story. And she really taught me how to think. I remember I would give her, sort of summaries of what other thinkers, great thinkers, had thought, and that's sort of how I thought you did it. And she said, "Well, what do you think?" And that simple prodding, that kind of thing, really, gave me a sense of the kind of work I wanted to do. Even if I was going to be wrong, I wanted to do something original, and she gave me the courage to do that. A law degree is a totally different kind of thing. It's a systematic way of thinking. It's trying to understand the language of courts and the codes that they're writing in, and to dive deep into the way that lawyers think and argue. And I think to think about the Constitution, both those elements are so important. You definitely have to understand, what are the courts doing in reversing Plessy versus Ferguson and the Brown case? What was happening in the striking down of this first Civil Rights Act in the 19th century. But I also want to bring a bigger frame and think about the ideas of democracy and the danger of authoritarianism. And so both those elements are crucial.
So let me ask you a personal question.
Sure.
A lot of education, PhD, and a law degree. And I have no idea, and I don't care to ask you this, but teaching at a university is not that remunerative compared to what you could be making outside in the civilian world. Why did you decide to teach at Brown?
I had been a teacher, I think, and in fact, I sort of worried that I would abandon it because of the incentives of money. But when I really thought about it, teaching great students, and I've been at Brown. I just turned 51. I started teaching in my late 20s. I think it was 28 my first year. I've been there about a little more than 22 years. And it's the pleasure that I get from it is it's beyond compare. I write these books with them as an audience. And I've also had the pleasure of teaching in law schools, which I've also loved, including often at Fordham Law School. Before that, University of Chicago Law School. And that gives you a different excitement, of young lawyers learning how to do this kind of thinking, and also pushing them to not just do the thinking about what the cases say, but whether or not they're decided rightly. I can't actually think of a profession that would give me anything like this gratification. And, money, I understand, of course. There are other ways to make it and to make more, but I wouldn't trade this for anything.
What impact has it had on this country that 30 of the 116 Supreme Court justices own slaves?
Well, I mean, there is no way to talk about the history of the American Constitution without understanding that the main question, really from the beginning, has been how can you have a document that is in the Declaration, but also in the Constitution, committed to principles of equality, and I'll say something about the preamble in a second, we the people, and how that figures in, and yet had this institution of enslavement until the end of the Lincoln administration, and even then a long period of recovery still to the idea of equal citizenship. That influence is seen in the sort of most important moment, and this is what I focus in on the book, in the second crisis. The first about Adams and the shutdown of dissent, of free speech. The second is the presidency of Buchanan. And Buchanan in his inaugural says, well, on the question of slavery, the court has these important things to decide, and I'm going to be neutral. And we know now, and Frederick Douglass saw it too, that far from that, he was really arguing with the court, persuading the court, I should say, endorsing the idea of deciding the Dred Scott case, the case that not only protects slavery, but really says that in the federal Constitution, Black Americans are not citizens, the most white supremacist moment in American history, the most evil decision, certainly, in American history. That is a pro-slavery idea. It isn't just a legal idea, too. It's an idea that Frederick Douglass saw for what it was, as evil. Now, there was a question, how do you respond to that, the fact that this court is so pro-slavery, this decision is so pro-slavery? And the dominant view of abolitionists was this whole thing is pro-slavery, the whole thing meaning the Constitution. And so William Lloyd Garrison essentially thought it was a pact with the devil. We should get rid of it all. And it was Douglass. If I had to pick one hero, we're talking about a lot of heroes, the grand jurors and Sadie Alexander, but there is one true hero of the book, the person I call the true founder of American democracy, not an 18th century founder, but in the 19th century founder, the person who pushed back, not just against Dred Scott, of course, but also against that idea that we should abandon the Constitution. And what Frederick Douglass saw was that the Constitution understood in terms of its principles, that was an idea of democracy incompatible with slavery. So I'll give you his arguments. That when you look not in the intents of the framers were all over the place. Some were trying to protect slavery, some were sympathetic to abolition. But when you look at the text, Douglass said, you see, it says we the people, not we the white people. There's a ban on the idea that you can inherit the crimes of parents, the ban on the corruption of blood. What is that, he says, but an anti-slavery principle? And of course, the idea that he gives us, even before Lincoln, that Lincoln resists, but comes to later, that the anti-slavery principle of the Declaration should frame all of the Constitution. That those are Douglass's profound ways of resisting a court that, as you say, doesn't just consist of people who owned other humans, who enslaved people, but who used their power in order to protect that ownership. The most powerful pushback is not Lloyd Garrison. That's not the founder of American democracy. He was an opponent, really, of the founding ideals. It's Frederick Douglass.
Who were Benjamin Bache, William Duane, and Thomas Cooper?
Other real heroes of the founding period who I celebrate as well. They are citizens who, after the passage of the Sedition Act, fight back. They're newspaper editors, writers, but they're not newspaper editors in the way that we think of journalists now as kind of objective. They were partisan opponents of the Federalist Party and of John Adams in particular. And what's incredible about this moment is that partly in reaction to the first gentleman that you mentioned, I pronounce his name Baki, but it might be Bosch, spelled Bosch. I'm actually not sure. He is seen as the target of the Sedition Act. And what what the Adams administration does, including Abigail Adams, who urges the passage of the Sedition Act, is they see the Sedition Act as a way of shutting down Adams' critics. It isn't just any limit on speech. By the way, the prosecutions under it are vast. Looks like 126 by one count. And they were an attempt to shut down essentially the opposition party. So calling them editors doesn't quite capture it. They're really the partisan critics, the arm of the Democratic Republican Party. Just to show you how partisan this piece of legislation is, it makes it a crime to criticize the President of the United States in its text, but it doesn't make it a crime to criticize the Vice President. That's Thomas Jefferson, a member of the opposition party, right? It's gerrymandered for a shutdown of speech. Now, it's not just that these are victims. They don't let themselves be victims. They use their trials, in particular, Duane and really Thomas Cooper, in order to highlight the idea that really their rights under the Constitution are being violated. The right to dissent, in particular, they say, is a right of free speech. And so Cooper, for instance, publishes his trial to show that really Adams is engaged in a kind of monarchist shutdown of free speech. Why doesn't the Supreme Court stop this? Listeners might, people watching this might think, why doesn't he go to the Supreme Court? You can't do that in a democracy. It's like shutting down Saturday Night Live. But Samuel Chase, the Supreme Court justice, lobbies for the act, sits on the trial of Cooper in order to make sure that he's prosecuted. And so from the beginning, there really are two ideas of what the First Amendment or what a constitution protects when it comes to free speech, including the right to free speech, the newly passed right to free speech. For the Federalists like Chase and for Adams, the president isn't an absolute monarch, but there's an analogy with the British monarch. And in the British common law, sedition isn't far from being illegal. That sedition is a crime that is guaranteed under the British common law. It's accepted. And so for them, with this more constitutional monarchist idea of the Constitution and the presidency, there's nothing wrong with the Sedition Act. It's not unconstitutional. So what these editors do, their heroism isn't just in fighting back, it's in really bringing to the conscience and the consciousness of America the idea that we have a right to dissent, a right to free speech means a right to criticize the president. That's so in our ether now, but they really have to fight for it. And the way they prevail isn't in court. They use the election of 1800. Presidents don't campaign at the time. I think Jefferson gave one speech and it didn't go well. So there's a lot of room. And they use that space, the editors, to argue that Adams, in his shutdown of free speech, is really shutting down, we the people, shutting down American democracy. And when Jefferson is elected at the behest of the efforts, really, of these editors, and he says in one of the most famous lines in American history, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. He's saying, I'm not going to shut down free speech. So the recovery comes not in court, but by citizens prevailing on recovery presidents, just as Sadie Alexander prevails on Truman to recover the idea of the Constitution. That pattern had been set earlier, and I should say before, the story also of Douglas, the end, the way he prevails is by prevailing, dialoguing with Lincoln, but really Grant in realizing these ideals of the Constitution as a democratic document.
You say in your book that there are 4,543 words in the Constitution. How often do you run into your students or run into students who have not read it?
Often. And, even among law students or among, students at Brown are brilliant, but there is not the kind of civic education that we need to see in this country. That, how have these, just to show the importance of this idea, why, some people might think, why do we need to read this thing? It's not that long, so it's not that much effort. But the reason it's important to read it is because the way we've recovered American democracy is through the words. These newspaper editors talked about the idea that Congress shall make no law abridging of freedom of speech. Frederick Douglass, as I said, used the text of the preamble. It says, we the people, he emphasized, not we the white people. That's maybe his most powerful argument. And so those words have power. They're the thing that allows citizens to grab onto the idea of the democratic Constitution, even against the most powerful person in the country, maybe the world, the President of the United States, when they oppose that idea. You can say, here it is.
What kind of reaction have you gotten from either your colleagues or people who've reviewed the book, or when you speak to people, and any of it surprise you?
I've been pleased. I mean, I wish that what was happening in the country wasn't happening. And some of the reaction of the book has been very positive, because in the Boston Globe review, I recommend, for instance, if people want to read a review of the book, it's brilliantly in-depth, careful, and it says that essentially this book predicts the future, because in our initial discussion about not recovering from Nixon, the book coming out the day after the Supreme Court said in its immunity decision, despite the fact that there's no text in the Constitution granting presidential immunity, that not just a sitting president, but a former president, at least in regard to his official duties, has presumptive immunity. First time in American history that's ever been said. What better example of the court saying essentially that the president can be above the law when it comes to the most dangerous moments, the official acts of a president. And so that review talks about the book really almost predicting the future, seeing that dangerousness that we were headed to. And the story, at the same time that it should be worrying, the book shows the fragility of American democracy, as we've seen. Nixon and Adams almost succeeded. His party, anyway, is engaged in a plot to deny, through a committee of Federalists, deny the certification of electoral votes. If that would have worked, and when it's uncovered by William Duane, that's the editor we haven't mentioned, who publishes this bill that was going to try to do this, they quickly tried to shut Duane down, as they did Bakke and as they will Cooper. If that would have succeeded, we might not have had a democracy. We wouldn't have had multi-party democracy in any sense, right? We would have had a totally different kind of quasi-monarchy in the way that Adams thought of it. If Douglas hadn't succeeded, we wouldn't have multiracial democracy. If Wilson had succeeded, we would have had a permanent system of national second-class citizenship. Nixon, as I argue, he did seem to partly succeed, and the immunity decision is an example of it. All of this shows the fragility of American democracy. That, I think, is what's frightening about the book, and people pick up on that. But at the same time that I think the book has a raw honesty, it also has hope. And I didn't want to write a book that was like all is lost, and I don't think that. I believe in the American Constitution and that written text, as we were talking about. And I believe the best way to vindicate the Constitution, is when you show it its power in the hands of citizens who rose up against these authoritarian presidents, didn't just rise up against them, but they won. And so the point of the book is, if they won in the past, we can win again in the future.
One name that you don't see very often anymore in books, that you mentioned more than once, is Patrick Henry. Wow. Why?
Wow. What a prescient, amazing, important person. Now, of course, I'm sure those watching us know Patrick Henry from his famous quote, "Give me liberty or give me death," and he was a revolutionary hero. But less understood, and maybe more important, is what he said at the time when the question was facing the country of whether or not the Constitution of the United States was going to be ratified. And Henry said no. He was an anti-federalist. Why was he against ratifying this document? It was because he said there was one serious, serious danger that exposed the fragility of the whole system. And that danger was the American presidency. And he said, look, people writing this document, this is his, I'm kind of giving the argument that he gives. I'll give you some of his quotes too, but they're assuming, like George Washington, who is presiding over the convention, a person of virtue. And the system is set up for a person of virtue. It might work well if you have a virtuous president. But what if you have a bad person in the office of the presidency? And then he says something quite striking. What if you have a criminal president, person with criminal ambitions or willing to commit crimes? And he says the checks aren't going to hold. The impeachment, the role of the court, those things aren't going to work. And you know what? He turns out to be largely right about that, as we've argued. Samuel Chase and Dred Scott. The court sometimes makes things way worse. And what about impeachment? Well, we've never removed a president or disqualified them through impeachment. We've had impeachments, but they've always failed in the Senate for presidential impeachments of Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton. Of course, the 2 Trump impeachments didn't work. And so his point is these checks aren't going to work. So what's going to happen is that the criminal president is going to be emboldened. So emboldened that when they see the checks don't work and that there's no one to stop them, what is to stop this, he's saying. And if the answer is nothing, he says something pretty frightening. He says that criminal president, that kind of person, will push for what he calls the American throne and will essentially crown themselves a monarch. And will make a bold push for the American throne, I think is the exact quote. And what's to stop them? Now, part of the argument of the book, the reason we have to take him so seriously and why that warning is so prescient is because the checks and balances that we learned, that I was really teaching in 7th grade civics, and they're important to teach, but the things the framers imagined working, Henry is right, they really don't work. The idea that the court is going to save American democracy whenever it's threatened is just not right. You see that in Samuel Chase. You see that in the Dred Scott case. You see that in Plessy versus Ferguson, which Wilson drew upon in making his arguments against Trotter. But what will work, and Henry didn't see this, and this is where I'll push back against Henry, is we the people, taking the document into our own hands and prevailing on recovery presidents to put things back. That has worked often in the most crucial, dangerous moments in American history, and it can work again.
As a close to this discussion, I want to go to the last sentence in your book. And you pay tribute to your deceased mother-in-law, Jenny, and you say she feared the rise of Trump and Trumpism, but believed in the power of committed citizens to overcome it. I dedicate the book to her memory. I suppose it's obvious, but why did you do it?
She was a hero, a children's rights advocate, somebody who was deeply interested in history. She would have loved this discussion because I know that she also watched C-SPAN. She considered doing a degree actually in history, PhD, but wound up becoming a children's rights lawyer and fighting her whole life for children's rights. And she also is from, and she would have liked me, I think, to mention this, from a tradition of civil rights, not only having been involved in the movement herself, but her father was a dean at the Louisville Seminary, and very early on in the civil rights movement, around, I don't have the exact date, but very early on, early 60s, invited Martin Luther King Jr. to speak at the Louisville Seminary, and that caused a huge outcry and reaction. And in fact, he lost a lot of speaking engagements that he had made money on in the summer. And when you listen to King, I found the tape, he acknowledges Jenny's father. That tradition really motivated her work, and it motivates me too. And I keep on my computer a picture of Martin Luther King with my wife's grandfather. And the book is partly about King, and we didn't speak about him, but some of these heroes are unknown. He is extremely well known, but less understood is that he was devoted to the Constitution. That in a dialogue with a student who said to him, "Look, you're talking a lot about theology," and actually with my wife's grandfather, they had discussions about Christian ethics. Of course, that was a huge part of King's thinking. But less understood is how much he valued the Constitution. And in this dialogue with this student, he came to the idea that recovery of the founding values would be a huge thing for the civil rights movement. Because what are the founding values about? They are about anti-tyranny, the anti-tyranny principle of the founding. And what is segregation but a tyranny? And as you start to think about his most famous speeches, for instance, the speech he gives before he's killed, where he talks about somewhere I read about a right to free speech, about a right to protest. He's talking, of course, about that idea of dissent recovered by those newspaper editors. His frequent invoking of the Declaration of Independence, the founding documents, That is the king that I'm trying to revive. And that personal connection through my wife's grandfather and through my mother-in-law, who actually got to speak to King on the phone when they were arranging this lecture at Louisville Seminary, it gave the book a personal dimension.
The name of the book is The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. Our guest has been Professor Corey Brettschneider of Brown University. Thank you, sir, for your time.
Thank you so much, Brian. I can't tell you what an honor it is to speak to you and to have you read this book so in depth. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @CSPAN Radio.